Hello, my name is Rose Misey, and my mapping project for Geography of Global Health focuses on the relationship between vulnerable elderly populations and their environments. So the three main ideas that guide this project are environment, health, vulnerability, and then how we address those issues that these three variables can pose in our communities to find justice. Now, here's a photo of a couple in Norway, actually, that's recently been ranked the country that is the best in the world for aging. It's really interesting to look at what the best place in the world is to grow old, but this project will mainly focus on places within the Twin Cities municipalities and where elderly populations are located there. Now, the research questions that guide my project are one, what kind of correlation is there between environmental quality and vulnerability for elderly populations? And two, if there is correlation, is it positive or negative? Now, why is this important? Well, according to a recent article by Time magazine, today more than 80% of Americans and 54% of the population worldwide do live in urban areas. And this means not only do we have a large part of the general population living in cities, but we have a lot of elderly people living in cities. So it's interesting to study as our population ages in general, the impact of living environment on vulnerable elderly persons. So an important indicator of health within a city is access, especially for elderly people, because as we age, often people suffer sight or hearing impairment, which means that they're unable to drive themselves places, and particularly vulnerable people will oftentimes not have a younger caretaker who can drive them places. So for residents who have decreased access to general amenities, they can be more vulnerable, especially when we're discussing decreased access to emergency services, hospitals, etc. So this is so important that the CDC is actually beginning to address the fact that older adults that can no longer drive but live in an area with transit options has the ability to stay mobile beyond the capacity of many in more rural and suburban areas. So in addition, they're looking at how we design communities to have recreational spaces, especially places like parks that can offer convenient alternatives to driving for older adults so that they can continue to have an active and healthy lifestyle. Now, I address this in my model builder by first off combining hospitals and fire departments to a general category of emergency services. And then I use the cost distance tool to determine distance from emergency services and the distance to transit in terms of accessibility. And after putting those through the raster calculator, I came up with two main things: areas that are near transit and emergency services and areas that are far from transit and emergency services. So the map that follows indicates that while these white areas that are close to transit and emergency services are pretty extensive for the Twin Cities, there is this ring around the outskirts of the city that is in pink, indicating places that are far. And so if you are an older person living in those areas, it'll be more difficult for you to have access to transit and emergency services unless if you have another option like a car. So this is really interesting to people such as the World Health Organization, who are really beginning to study where elderly people live. And so they say that in most countries, general habitat systems are oriented towards people in between 15 and 55 years old, which can make a lot of things very exclusive for people who are elderly. And so as the global population does age, places that feature amenities that are easily accessible, like open water, parks, and underdeveloped areas, will hold greater appeal. Now, when I was looking at amenities that are really important in a city, the three that I wanted to focus on was firstly open water, second parks, and then underdeveloped areas, so large open spaces. In Model Builder, I selected each of these variables and then I calculated the distance from them from any point in the Twin City, and then I looked at the raster calculator to combine these three variables and find a general distance from amenities. This is the map that follows. As you can see, it really follows the open water issue. When you're looking at the map, you can pretty clearly find the Mississippi River, which does make the Twin Cities kind of unusual because of the amount of open water we have. It's very clear in the map the locations of these water sources. So now, on the other hand, let's look at the distance from disamenities. And the three variables I wanted to look at were 1, Superfund sites, 2, petroleum brownfields, and 3, proximity to highways. Now, on that portion of my model, I selected each feature and I calculated the distance. I put twice the emphasis on distance from Superfund sites by adding the variable twice in my raster calculator because it's such an undesirable place to live. And this is the map that follows. So you can see that especially Superfund sites tend to be located within the city. Now, when we combine these two sections of the model, we come up with a map that is for environmental quality in general. Now, when you look at this map, you can see that there is a diffusion of lower quality to higher coming from the center of the city. Now, turning more towards vulnerability, in my project, I define vulnerability by the percent of population, one, with a college education, because your level of education in general can really impact your quality of life over the years. 2, with minority status, as people who are more likely to face discrimination do have a large impact on quality of life and being a vulnerable population. 3rd, over 85 years old. And then 4th, median household income. Now, I selected each of these features and I put them into the raster calculator in a way that placed 3 times the emphasis on standardized population over 85 because it was so important to me that we address the issue of elderly people. Elderly people who fall into all of these categories, but that is the main goal of the project, is to understand where elderly people live, so we place the emphasis there. And then this is the map that comes out of it. It's very interesting when you look at it because it does, the blue areas, which are less vulnerable, are definitely farther out of the city, kind of forming a ring, and then more vulnerable, a bit more interspersed within the center. Now, after running the OLS regression tool, this is the map that I found. Same information, just presented slightly differently, and it becomes even more clear the ring that surrounds the city. Now, when I did the OLS regression tool for amenities, we noticed that the majority of amenities are centered in the middle of the map. So then let's look at this in a different way. So the relationship between amenities and vulnerability in a scatter plot, you might expect there to be a more clear-cut relationship between the two, but the Twin Cities is really interesting because the amount of amenities just in general throughout all the municipalities is pretty high, just for accessibility to parks and open water and underdeveloped areas, so that it's harder to find this link between amenities and vulnerability, which makes it an exception to this global trend. But looking even closer at local exceptions, we find that 2 places that both are very high in terms of vulnerability are Lilydale and Randolph, yet they have strikingly different amounts of amenities in each. So looking at Randolph, which is very small, it has a population of 318, we're reminded once again that this is definitely an urban story for understanding the situation of vulnerable populations of elderly people, because Randolph is actually, although it's included in the municipalities of the Twin Cities, it's definitely removed from the majority of municipalities. So when we look at the aerial view, we notice that it's surrounded by farmland. So it's interesting that it's included, and it's kind of an explanation as to why perhaps it has less access to the amenities of the city. Now, when we look at Lilydale, which has a population of 552, it's much closer to the center of things. It's just south of St. Paul, and it has very high access to amenities. When we look at the aerial view, it's very clear that it's surrounded by green space. It's right next to the river, which is an explanation as to why it, though it has a vulnerable population, it scores so high in amenities. Now, what does all this mean in terms of the big picture? Well, to bring these local exceptions back, the amount of elderly people living in cities worldwide um, is really important to the World Health Organization, and they actually met during October of 2015. 75 UN member states and 35 non-governmental organizations drafted a global action plan on aging and health. So in specific, Preambulatory Clause 3, Section 3 of the draft resolution says that it calls for maximizing the functional abilities of older populations. It calls for a deep transformation of environments and of the health and social systems that contribute to well-being. So why are these local exceptions so important? Well, because they're an exception to the normal rule that my research indicated, um, it makes us look closer at how can we base the design of other cities on this success story of making areas in a city have so many amenities accessible to everybody. So thank you for watching. If you're interested, these are the sources that I referenced throughout the presentation.